Hello there, world history people. Let's keep learning about World War I in my final video lesson. I titled this part Ledenvolk, and it's a German phrase meaning suffering people. And during the entirety of World War I, Germany was under a blockade. And a blockade is like the Germans or the British, they got their entire fleet and they just cut off all access from Germany to the world's oceans. And I'll even show you some pictures here. It's just an incredible amount of ships. Nothing got through. And the country of Germany was sort of set up to be a manufacturing company. And Germany didn't have enough farmland to produce food to feed their own people. Germany relied on trading the stuff they made to get food from other parts of the world. So even pretty early on in this war, Germany started running out of stuff to eat. And the soldiers always ended up getting enough food to fight, but the people who really suffered were the civilians, the people back home. So that's kind of what this picture's showing you here. These are some hungry kids, and it's pretty messed up that this is what was the reality of World War I. All right, let's click ahead. So yeah, here's the entire British fleet just parked off the coast of Germany, and they just had this great line just cutting off any ships from getting close to Germany. Hungry children, hungry kids. Okay, and then this is quite a telling thing to know. In the last year of World War I, the great influenza pandemic started. And it would actually go on for a couple years even after World War I, but it would end up killing 100 million people around the world, or 5% of the world's population. It was also known as the Spanish flu, but that's a terrible name for it because people thought it started in Spain. It didn't. It started in Asia. And this disease it was by all accounts just a crazy hardcore version of influenza, very similar to COVID-19. And it was a very, very deadly disease. But some interesting differences, though, is the Great Influenza Pandemic especially hurt people of middle age. So it would be people, in their 20s and 30s. COVID-19 is an especially deadly disease for older people. But one of the reasons why this comes at Germany especially hard is the rest of the world was trading some of these medications to help with influenza. Germany didn't have any of those medicines. And the Allied powers in World War I made sure that Germany didn't get any of that medicine coming through the blockade. So Germany was under a lot of pressure to do something to help their people because this disease was ravaging the entire world, and the Allies didn't want to send any help to the German people. So yep, influenza in 1918. There's some people being treated with influenza, and here they are turning a high school gym into influenza beds. Okay, and then another big point I want to make is just shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. This didn't just affect Germany, but infected people on all sides of the war. That if you're a soldier who's been in this trench for 3 or 4 years, like, oh my goodness, the way it affects you psychologically, you're constantly afraid that you could come under attack, that a bomb could go off, that there could be a gas attack. It was an emotional trauma that has never been experienced to this degree in world history ever. And even after the war, a lot of these soldiers were mentally affected by their experiences to a terrible degree. So this guy's getting yelled at for supposedly not being tough enough. Here's a guy showing you the idea of PTSD. And here's some soldiers trying to help each other out. Okay, and to go along with that slide, the men who survived World War I in all countries involved are collectively known as the Lost Generation, because 1 out of 4 men who went off to World War I never came back. And many of the men who did come back were, had missing legs, had messed up faces, had wounds. But the thing I really want to emphasize is a lot of the wounds weren't just physical, they were mental wounds as well. And it really is seen in the art and the culture of that time period, that this was not a war that anyone was proud to have fought in. It was a war of just incredible violence and death. All right, here's some guys with prosthetic legs. And here's a guy whose face was kind of messed up, so they gave him a clay mask to wear all the time. Here's a guy who lost his arms. All these guys lost their legs. And here's a guy who got probably like shot in the face here. He also lost an eye, but they gave this guy a mask. And if you go back in time to the year 1920, you'd see a whole lot of people who look like this, who are trying to re-blend themselves into society, but clearly you can still visually see the wounds they suffered. Okay. All right, and this is my last bit. How did the war finally end? Well, for all the reasons I mentioned in the first half of this video, Germany reluctantly surrenders. They realize their people can't take it anymore, so Germany contacts the Allied powers and says, we want to quit the war. On November 11th in 1918 at 11:11 a.m., and they said that's going to be when we're going to finally stop fighting. And this is one of the few holidays that's actually celebrated all around the world, and still to this day we know it as Veterans Day. We always get it off as a holiday, and it commemorates World War I. So whenever it's 11/11/11 on that day, you should be like, boom, that's when World War I ended so many years ago. Okay, so here's the German guys coming into this train car to sign the documents of surrendering the German army. And then here's a bunch of people excited. Germany surrendered the war. And Germany surrenders, armistice signed, cease on all fronts at 11 a.m. Okay, so the war's end. Well, when the war is now officially over, Germany surrendered. So Germany is under the understanding that they're going to have to give up some stuff to the Allied powers. So Germany wasn't the only part of the Central Powers, of course. There was also Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. But both those countries dissolved at the end of the war, and their governments collapsed, and no one was really left to account for them or talk to. So sort of the last opponent remaining on the global stage was Germany. And all of the countries who were part of the Allies came or sent their representatives to France, and they met in the Palace of Versailles in the most famous room of the world, the Hall of Mirrors. And they were going to have a big talk about how we should punish Germany. And it's important to remember, at the beginning of World War I, Germany was the biggest, most powerful country in Europe. So a lot of people were like, okay, we're all going to take a share of some of Germany's economic power. Okay, so here's a bunch of those representatives meeting in the Hall of Mirrors. These were the four kind of big representatives. This is Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. George Clemenceau, the President of France. I don't remember this guy, but I think this guy was Chamberlain of the United Kingdom. Okay, and here they are, the greatest moment in history. All these representatives are going to talk about how to make peace in the world. Okay, so Germany's punishments can be remembered with the term brat, okay? So at the Treaty of Versailles, they came up with these four big ideas that Germany would be forced to accept. Germany, first of all, had to accept blame for the entire war. Every person who died in the war, it was Germany's fault. And Germany read that and was like, wait, we got into this war because Austria-Hungary asked to help us fight Russia. It was kind of Austria-Hungary was the one who started it. But whatever, Germany didn't mind that one in a terrible way. The thing that really affected Germany was the idea that they had to pay reparations. And they said, Germany, you have to pay $33 billion in damage to all the Allied nations. You have to pay us for every bullet we made, every gun we made, for every life we lost, for every house you destroyed. And most of that money was actually sent to France. And Germany was like, $33 billion? That's like more money than we can make in 20 years. But the historic reality is Germany eventually did pay that entire bill, and they paid it, the last payment in 1995. Okay, I was in middle school in 1995. That's crazy. All right, Germany was forbidden to have an army, navy, or air force. Germany, you're not allowed to have any kind of military ever again. And Germany lost all its overseas territories and some land to the Allies. So Germany got punished real bad for World War I. And I mean, my sort of question for you kids is was this a fair punishment? Cause Germany to pay money to France and the other Allied nations for the next 80 years? It was something that the German people at first were like, there's no way we can accept this. But the alternative is the war keeps going and Germany was starving and needed the medicine. So I mean, honestly, they could have written in the Treaty of Versailles, hey, Germany, we're going to just take every piece of property in your entire country, and Germany would have probably been forced to sign it. Okay, so here they are forcing the terms on Germany, and Germany's like, dang it, I guess I have to sign. And then here's the president of France. He was the one who really enforced a lot of these really hard policies on Germany, and there's Germany walking into a guillotine. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about President Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States at the time. He was there at the Treaty of Versailles, and yes, he wanted Germany to be punished for the war to a degree, but the bigger thing in his mind was he wanted a new world order. He wanted everybody to get along, and he had this idea to create an organization that he would call the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was outlined in his 14 points. He wanted free trade with everybody. He didn't want any more of this colonialism and imperialism. He wanted a reduction in military. He didn't want any more of these secret treaties. He wanted an open, free world that could hopefully be peaceful for the remainder of world history. And this League of Nations that I talked about in the last slide, its official language would be French. I mean, the French just kind of enforced that on everybody. Its headquarters would be in Switzerland, the neutral nation in the middle of Europe. And the whole point was every country would send an ambassador, and at the League of Nations, they would talk about problems and prevent war and just make international law and international rules and help us avoid conflict in the future. So I think overall it's a good idea. But the League of Nations is a terrible failure. I mean, look, I can show you in this slide right here. It's supposed to be representatives from all over the world. Who do you see in the League of Nations? It's just a bunch of white men. And during this time, Vietnam was owned by France, big parts of Africa were owned by France and Britain and Germany. So they just appointed white guys to lead those parts of Africa and Asia. So there weren't authentic representatives, and people really didn't respect the rules that were made in the League of Nations. The other real sad thing is Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat president. He came back from Paris with the Treaty of Versailles and with this idea for the League of Nations, and his Congress was mostly Republican. He says, okay, guys, sign this paper. We should join the League of Nations. I'm the one who mostly came up with it. And the Congress of the United States said no. So America never joined the League of Nations. And if you don't even have the United States as a part of this international organization, the organization isn't going to be very strong. Germany isn't allowed to join the League of Nations. It's another one of their punishments for World War I. And so Germany feels really neglected by that organization. Japan quits the organization, says they're being unfair. And as I mentioned, France and Britain don't have their colonies personally represented. So it was basically an organization of British and French guys giving each other high fives. It was not an authentic representation of how people felt around the world, so it would be kind of worthless. Okay, moving on. So here's Japan stepping on the League of Nations. And then here's Woodrow Wilson smoking idealism. And what's going to happen to his ideal of the League of Nations? Well, it's going to pop. Okay, they're not going to prevent another world war. And let's go back to the focus on Germany. So Germany was required to pay $33 billion to France and the other allies. So Germany was like, you know what? You want us to pay money? Okay, we'll just print money. So Germany just started printing, $1,000 bills and just sending that money to France. And they're like, okay, France, we sent you $33 billion. Are you happy? Well, the French people then started using some of that money to buy stuff in Germany. And I mean, Germany has to accept the money, I guess. So Germany's economy went into a state of hyperinflation where money became worthless. Because yes, these French people have these $1,000 notes. And if you're a German who only has a $1 bill, that $1 bill is like nothing in comparison. So many more German people suffered incredible financial losses during this period, and their economy just went into total shambles. So do not just print money. That'll cause some very, very challenging effects to your economy, kids. Okay, so here's a German girl who's has a little, hello, I'm looking for a job sign on her body, and this sign It's saying, like, these are all of her skills, and she will work for food. She doesn't want to work for money because it's not worthless, or it's now worthless. Yeah, Germany's like, okay, you want all this money? Here, I'll just print off more for you. Here's guys selling, I think this is like corn for $50,000 an ear of corn. So their money's just outrageous. Here's a guy bringing a wheelbarrow full of money to try to buy stuff. Here's people just like throwing money in the street because it's worthless. It just turned into monopoly money. And still this whole time kids are struggling to eat. And here's a banker just stacking worthless dollar bills. Okay. So, and in Germany, the German people are just getting really, really frustrated with how they're being treated by the international community. The German military was still fighting in France at the end of the war when they surrendered. They felt like they didn't really lose. And now they got this really bad peace deal that made them feel really insulted and neglected. And there were many Germans who thought, you know, gosh, if we just kept fighting that war, maybe we could have won it somehow. And so here's a German veteran who's begging for money. You can see he lost a leg in the war. And then here's a bunch of people protesting. And then this is a German soldier in World War I, who you'll probably be very familiar with, especially when we talk about World War II. But by all accounts, this guy, he fought valiantly in the trenches. He got some medals for bravery. At one point, he was actually hit by a gas attack. And when the war ended, he was actually in a hospital recovering from the gas attack. And he said, gas should never be used on soldiers. And that's a promise he actually does keep for the rest of his life. But he is known for using gas on Jewish people in a pretty disgusting event called the Holocaust. This is a picture of Adolf Hitler. And here's a protest for people saying they were upset how World War I ended. And there they found Hitler in that crowd cheering people on, saying that Germany needs to rise again, and they would win if they only had another shot. Okay, so the next unit I'll talk about is what's up with Russia, and I'll talk about that in the next unit. Okay, peace out.